The international terminal in Los Angeles was already crowded by 7 in the morning. A river of rolling suitcases and tired travelers moved beneath fluorescent lights that never seemed to dim. Somewhere in that river walked a woman in a faded hoodie and worn jeans, pulling a cheap suitcase with a broken wheel that squeaked against the tile. She looked like nobody in particular, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Nobody in that terminal could have guessed that the quiet woman gripping a scuffed backpack strap had once been trained to disappear into rooms full of danger and walk out without leaving a single trace. Within the hour, a police officer would slam his boot into her leg in front of hundreds of witnesses, accusing her of resisting arrest for a crime she had nothing to do with. Cell phones would rise into the air, screams would echo off the terminal ceiling, and nobody standing there filming would understand that they were about to witness the awakening of a woman the government itself had once been too afraid to name out loud. Her name was Maya Brooks, and she was 34 years old, though something in the stillness of her eyes made her seem both younger and far older than that number suggested. She wore no jewelry, carried no expensive luggage, and moved through the terminal with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned long ago that panic never solved anything. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman heading home from a long shift. In truth, she was flying to Washington to start a quiet, unremarkable civilian job, the kind of position that came with a badge that opened doors but never announced itself. She had chosen it on purpose. After everything she had lived through, she wanted mornings that felt ordinary. Even so, certain habits refused to leave her body. She counted exits without meaning to, cataloging every door, every stairwell, every gap in the crowd where danger could slip through. She never sat with her back to an open room. A therapist had once gently suggested that such hypervigilance might ease with time. It had not eased, not fully, though she had learned to carry it quietly. These were not choices anymore. They were instincts carved so deep into her that she barely registered doing them. Years earlier, Maya had served in a classified special operations unit that did not exist on paper, the kind of unit whose members were erased from official records the moment they were recruited. She had walked into embassies under siege and walked out again before backup even arrived. She had done things that saved lives, and things she chose never to speak of again. Now she simply wanted to be forgotten, and for years the world had cooperated. She had spent nights in places without names on any official map, trained to control her own heartbeat the way other people controlled their breathing. She had learned to read a room in seconds, to identify the single most dangerous person in a crowd, before that person even realized they had been noticed. That training had cost her friendships, relationships, entire years of her life spent invisible to everyone who might have loved her. When she finally left the service, she carried both pride and quiet grief in equal measure. Boarding that flight in Los Angeles, she told herself those years were finally behind her, that the woman in the hoodie pulling a broken suitcase was simply Maya now. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every visible way. Announcements crackled overhead. A toddler cried near the coffee kiosk. Maya checked the time on a cracked phone screen and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine the calm apartment waiting for her on the other coast. She had no idea that a young officer standing near the gate had already noticed her, already begun building a story about her that had nothing to do with the truth, a story that, within 20 minutes, would nearly cost her everything she had worked so hard to leave behind. Officer Ryan Coleman had been on the force for less than 2 years, long enough to develop a reputation for two things: an eagerness to prove himself and a temper that flared faster than it should have. He wanted to be the officer who caught something big on an otherwise uneventful shift, and that hunger made him dangerous. His training officer had warned him twice about jumping to conclusions before gathering facts, but Ryan dismissed the warnings as timidity. He believed, with the unshakable confidence of the inexperienced, that his instincts were sharper than his colleagues gave him credit for. That morning, scanning the crowd near the business class corridor, his eyes landed on Maya, and within seconds he had already decided who she was without asking a single question. Her clothes were plain, her suitcase was old, she traveled alone, and she was near a section of the terminal reserved, in his mind, for people who looked nothing like her. He noticed her skin before he noticed anything else about her, and though he'd never admit it, that shaped every judgment that followed. He told himself he was simply being observant. In reality, he was building a case against an innocent woman based on nothing but appearance and prejudice, dressed up as procedure. The excuse arrived minutes later, small and almost meaningless. A businessman rushing toward his gate bumped into another traveler and dropped his wallet without noticing, the leather billfold sliding across the floor near a support pillar. Nobody around him seemed to notice except Ryan, who once again fixed his attention on Maya, standing roughly 10 feet away with her eyes on the departure board. He did not check security footage. He did not ask the businessman a single question. He crossed the floor toward her with the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome of an encounter that hadn't yet begun. Maya noticed him approaching and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever authority moved toward her without warning, a feeling she had learned to manage through years of discipline. She met his eyes calmly, prepared to cooperate. When he accused her of taking the wallet, she explained evenly that she hadn't touched anyone's belongings and had simply been checking her flight information. Ryan didn't listen. He demanded she hand over her bag, his voice rising loud enough to draw glances from nearby travelers. Maya, still calm, offered to open her bag voluntarily. Instead of accepting her cooperation, Ryan grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the pillar. Phones began lifting into the air. Maya kept her hands visible, her voice steady, repeating that she was not resisting. But Ryan's anger had already outpaced his judgment. Without warning, he swept his boot against the back of her leg, driving her down onto the hard terminal floor in front of everyone. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She caught herself with one hand, her expression tightening not with fear but with controlled disbelief, the product of years of training never to react emotionally in moments of danger. Ryan, breathing hard and clearly startled by his own escalation, reached for his handcuffs. He yanked one of her wrists behind her back, then the other, snapping the cuffs shut with more force than necessary while pressing his knee against her shoulder. Maya's voice stayed level even as pain shot through her joints. "I am not resisting," she repeated, again and again, refusing to give him any excuse to escalate further, despite everything in her training screaming that she could end this encounter in under 2 seconds, if she chose to. Ryan ignored her, ordering her to kneel, his frustration turning into something closer to cruelty. Nearby, an airport security officer named Denise Walker watched with a growing knot of unease that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with instinct. 11 years on the job had taught her to recognize when an officer was spiraling out of control instead of following protocol. Maya's posture, even cuffed and kneeling, remained oddly composed, her breathing controlled. Denise had seen frightened people before. This woman did not look frightened. She looked like someone waiting patiently for a mistake to correct itself. Overhead, the terminal cameras recorded everything without a single frame missing. Maya said so clearly, more than once. "Check the cameras." Her voice never rose, never broke. Ryan refused outright, his pride unwilling to entertain the possibility that he'd made an enormous mistake in front of dozens of witnesses. Leaning down toward her with a sneer, he asked her who she thought she was. Maya said nothing, and that silence unsettled him more than any argument could have. Something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of calculation replacing the patience she'd held on to until then. The crowd began to sense the same thing Denise already had. This woman was not simply enduring what was happening to her, she was choosing to. The moment everything changed happened faster than the shaky cell phone footage could clearly capture. Ryan, frustrated by her continued calm, reached for his baton and swung it toward her in a motion meant to intimidate. What happened next was not a decision so much as a reflex, a survival instinct built through years of training, waiting in her muscles like a coiled spring. Maya's wrists, though restrained, twisted with a speed that seemed to bend physics itself. Her body pivoted low and fast as she intercepted his arm before the baton could complete its arc. In one fluid motion, she redirected the weapon out of his grip, locked his wrist at an angle that made resistance pointless, and used his own momentum to bring him down onto the terminal floor. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 seconds, so quick that witnesses would later swear they'd missed the middle of it, their eyes jumping from Ryan standing to Ryan flat on his back with Maya's knee controlling his shoulder. She did not strike him. She did not retaliate with excess force of any kind. She simply neutralized the threat with the precise, economical control of someone who had spent years learning exactly how much force a situation required, and never using a single ounce more. The terminal fell into a stunned, almost theatrical silence. Two nearby officers stood frozen, hands hovering uselessly near their belts. Passengers who had been filming lowered their phones, then raised them again, suddenly aware that whatever this woman was, she was not the person Ryan had accused her of being. Maya rose calmly, stepped back, and raised both of her still-cuffed hands into plain view, making it unmistakably clear she had no intention of causing further harm. The alarm came seconds later. Ryan, humiliated and furious, scrambled to his radio and screamed that he was being attacked by a suspect resisting arrest. Within moments, additional officers poured into the terminal from every direction, radios crackling with conflicting reports of an assault in progress. Maya stood perfectly still amid the chaos, hands raised, making no sudden movements. She had faced far more dangerous rooms than this one, and she understood that stillness was now her greatest weapon. Within minutes, a call went out requesting a specialized tactical response, and a heavily armed unit began moving toward the terminal. The commander of that unit, Marcus Delaney, a veteran of both domestic tactical operations and, years earlier, several classified assignments, arrived and fixed his eyes on Maya's posture. Something about the precise, economical way she stood, weight-balanced, breathing controlled, triggered a memory buried deep in his mind. He had seen that exact posture only once before, years earlier, during a briefing so classified most of the room hadn't been allowed to take notes. A superior officer describing an operative whose training was so complete that even at rest, her body remained ready to respond to any threat in a fraction of a second. Watching Maya now, Delaney no longer doubted that description at all. Nearby stood a federal agent named Thomas Reyes, passing through on unrelated business when the commotion began. Watching Maya, his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as pieces of a distant memory clicked into place. He had seen a face like hers once before, in a briefing photograph so heavily redacted that only a sliver of her features had been visible, attached to a name that wasn't really a name at all. He stepped back, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number reserved for situations far more serious than airport misunderstandings. "I think I am looking at Ghost Raven," he said quietly, his voice tight with disbelief and urgency that made the person on the other end go silent for several long seconds. Ghost Raven was not a name spoken casually, even among people cleared to know it existed. The operative behind that designation was a legend among a very small circle, credited with hostage rescues that never appeared in any newspaper, and counter-terrorism operations that had quietly unraveled organizations most of the public had never heard of. She had, on more than one occasion, provided close protection for heads of state in situations too sensitive to ever be declassified. Almost nobody had ever seen her face. Word moved with startling speed toward Washington, landing on desks belonging to people whose titles rarely appeared in public directories. This was not a situation to be managed through ordinary channels. Sirens rose in the distance. Within 20 minutes, an entire convoy of federal vehicles descended toward the terminal. Ryan, still nursing his wounded pride and utterly unaware of the storm heading toward him, kept insisting the situation was exactly as he'd described it. That certainty was about to collapse entirely. Delaney's radio crackled with a voice carrying unmistakable authority. "No one is to point a weapon at that woman under any circumstances." Officers exchanged confused glances, lowering weapons they'd only just raised, unsure why an unarmed woman commanded this level of caution from people several ranks above their pay grade. Moments later, a black federal vehicle pulled directly onto the terminal floor through an emergency access route. A tall man in a plain dark suit stepped out, his posture marking him as someone of significant rank despite no visible insignia. He crossed the floor with brisk, purposeful steps, his eyes fixed entirely on Maya. When he reached her, he stopped, straightened his shoulders, and rendered a crisp, formal salute in front of an entire terminal of stunned onlookers. Maya, still handcuffed, met his eyes with quiet recognition and offered the faintest nod in return. The terminal fell into a silence so complete the hum of the overhead lights became audible. Ryan's face drained of color as he watched a general saluting the very woman he'd thrown to the ground less than an hour earlier. He opened his mouth to say something. No words came. The general, Harold Whitfield, ordered the handcuffs removed immediately, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. An officer fumbled with the key, finally freeing Maya's wrists as the crowd watched in reverent silence. She rubbed her wrists gently, her expression calm. Whitfield asked quietly whether she was hurt. Maya shook her head, telling him she had endured far worse in far worse places. With the immediate danger resolved, attention shifted to the truth of what had happened. Airport officials pulled security footage from every camera covering the incident and played it on a large screen near the information desk. The footage left no ambiguity. Ryan had approached Maya without legitimate cause, shoved her without provocation, and struck her leg with a deliberate, unprovoked kick. The businessman who dropped his wallet stepped forward and confirmed Maya had never gone near his belongings. Security located the wallet exactly where it had fallen, untouched, confirming that Ryan's entire accusation had been built on nothing more than a careless assumption fueled by prejudice. Within the hour, clips of the confrontation, filmed from a dozen angles, began spreading rapidly across the internet, drawing outrage from people who'd never set foot in that airport. News anchors picked up the story by early afternoon. Civil rights advocates pointed to the incident as another example of a pattern they'd been documenting for years, assumptions about appearance replacing actual evidence in the split-second decisions officers were trained to make. Internal affairs investigators arrived within the hour. The lead investigator, Patricia Hayes, watched the recording 3 times before turning to her team. There was no ambiguity here, she said quietly, no gray area to debate in a closed room later. Ryan was informed, in front of many of the same witnesses who'd watched his initial accusation, that he was being relieved of duty pending a full investigation. His badge was removed on the spot, and he was placed in handcuffs himself, the same restraints he'd used on Maya now closing around his own wrists. He was led out through the terminal in full view of the crowd, offering no resistance, the fight having drained entirely out of him. Denise Walker stepped forward to give a full account of everything she'd witnessed. Several other passengers came forward as well, offering accounts that corroborated the footage in every respect. Within days, police officials issued a formal public apology, promising a thorough review of training and accountability procedures. A senior official personally sought Maya out to deliver that apology. Maya listened patiently, and when he finished, she offered a response that would later be repeated in news coverage across the country. "I do not need an apology," she said quietly. "I just want this to stop happening to people who have done nothing wrong." The simplicity and quiet dignity of that statement silenced the room completely. In the days that followed, Maya declined every interview request that came her way, turning away journalists and producers alike with the same quiet resolve she'd shown throughout the ordeal. She had spent her career avoiding attention, and she had no intention of letting one chaotic morning undo years of carefully maintained privacy. She retrieved her worn backpack, adjusted the strap over her shoulder, and quietly requested to be rebooked onto a later flight. Airport staff, still visibly shaken, arranged everything for her without hesitation. She walked back through the terminal alone, and though everything about how people looked at her had changed, nobody approached her. They simply watched her pass with a kind of hushed reverence. Later that afternoon, in a quiet office far from the airport, a young recruit training under General Whitfield's command found the courage to ask how strong Ghost Raven really was. Whitfield considered the question for a long moment, then walked to the window and looked out over the base. "The most frightening thing about her was never how many people she could defeat," he finally said. "It was that for years she consistently chose not to. True strength," he continued, "was never about the ability to dominate a room. It was about the discipline required to walk away from 100 opportunities to do exactly that, choosing instead the harder, quieter path of restraint. Anyone could learn to throw a punch. Almost nobody was ever taught the far more difficult skill of choosing peace when violence would have been so much easier to justify." Somewhere over the country by then, Maya sat beside the window of her flight, watching clouds drift past beneath a sky turning gold with the fading afternoon light. Her wrists still ached faintly from the cuffs, and a small bruise was forming along her leg. But her expression carried none of the tension the morning might have justified. She thought of the crowd's stunned silence, of Denise's steady testimony, of the general's crisp salute in the middle of a chaotic terminal floor, and allowed herself a small, private moment of quiet satisfaction. She thought too of Ryan, led away in the very cuffs he had used on her, and found she felt no real anger toward him anymore, only a tired kind of sadness for how easily assumption had replaced judgment in a moment that never needed to become anything at all. She closed her eyes as the plane leveled out above the clouds, her breathing slow and even, her body finally allowing itself to rest after a morning that had tested every ounce of discipline she'd spent years building. She realized that this morning, for the first time in a long while, the truth about her had been forced into the open against her wishes. It was a strange kind of exposure, one she had spent her entire career avoiding, and yet she found she did not regret it, because it had also exposed something far more important than her own identity, exactly how easily an innocent person's dignity could be stripped away by someone wielding authority without wisdom, and exactly how rarely such moments were ever corrected before real harm was done. The terminal behind her would remember that day for a long time, retelling the story of the woman nobody suspected, until the moment everything changed in the space of a few unforgettable seconds. But for Maya, it was simply one more chapter, closed quietly. Another reminder that the greatest strength a person could carry was not the power to strike, but the wisdom and self-command to know precisely when never to use it at all. And somewhere above the clouds, carried gently forward toward a new beginning, she finally allowed herself to rest in the kind of peace that only comes to those who have already proven, again and again, exactly who they are.